In the late autumn of 2010, in a forest in Mengele Parish in Latvia, a group of military history enthusiasts was examining a World War II site. They were hoping to find weapons and ammunition. Instead, they found this. The rusty dairy can had been buried in the ground for a long time. How long became clear after opening it. It contained men's clothes, 2 wartime watches, a hand-cranked lamp, bicycle parts, and several newspapers. The date? August the 10th, 1948.
1948. gada 10. augustā. Izlaista cīņa.
It was clearly not a wartime find. Somebody had buried the can at least 3 years after the Second World War. But who and why? At the very bottom of the can lay a used gun shell. In it, the searchers found an Agfa photographic film with an expiration date of May 1948. It appeared to be used, but did the 62-year-old film contain any images? To find out, the film was given to a professional photographer who developed it. The news of the unique find spread quickly. The photos were reprinted in the local newspapers, and it was not long before the identity of one of the people in the mysterious images was established. He was recognized by his son, the 84-year-old Zintas Kvants. He told us that the last time he saw his father was in 1947. He was a resistance fighter who fought against the Soviet regime that had occupied his land. He took his gun and went into the forest at a time when people on the other side of Europe were celebrating VE Day.
In the center of empire, with hearts beating high with pride and joy, crowds in their millions await the official word that victory has been won in the West.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. This is certainly not the liberated Europe we fought to build up, nor is it one which contains the essentials of permanent peace.
Behind the line that divided Europe lay also the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. A British diplomat who visited the capital of the occupied Latvia in 1945 reported to London, "Latvians of all classes seem most unhappy under the restored Soviet regime and still look to the United Kingdom and the United States for restoration of their independence. Emotions are, however, mostly passive, as the spirit has been ground out of people by events since 1940. The year 1940 marked the end of independence for the Baltic states, as they were invaded by the Red Army. The first Soviet occupation lasted only 1 year, but the events which took place during that year were so horrific that it was later called the Year of Horror.
Experience of the first Soviet-Russian occupation was a year of trauma where the majority of families were in some way affected. Many of our relatives were deported. I lost my godfather. He was too slow climbing into the cattle car and simply shot.
The brutal mass deportations took place on June the 14th, 1941. Entire families were loaded into cattle cars and transported to Siberia. Nearly half of the deportees did not survive. 14-year-old Vera Seeberger was lucky. She was not deported that day, but her 2-year-old godsister was. Vera and her mother rushed to the station and begged the armed men to free the little girl.
Stacijas priekšā varbūt, jā, no pirmā perona bija beigās tam vienam pēdējām, kas tur nu stāvēja it kā atbildīgais. Mana mamma nometās ceļos viņa priekšā. Nometās ceļos, un viņš atļāvās ar savu lielo zābaku viņu tā pastumt. Mamma, protams, apgāzās. Un tad viņš teica, nu, ja jums tik ļoti vajag, tad atstājiet savu meitu, es jums varu samainīt.
So that was the experience, and that really helps to explain attitudes that followed as the occupying regimes changed. The earliest reaction to the Germans coming in was a relief. The deportation simply stopped. They couldn't continue.
Dank und Freude der befreiten Bevölkerung kennen keine Grenzen.
Kad sākās karš, gaidīja, kā glābējus vāciešus, kā glābējus. Ja. Ar puķiem, ar speki, ar olam, ar sviestu cienāja vāciešus. Kamer viņi ļāva pacelt karogu. Ja.
Many of those who greeted the Germans as liberators soon became disillusioned. Many lost their lives. Nazi rule was no liberation, but neither was Soviet rule, which returned to the Baltic states once the Second World War was over. A British diplomat reported from Riga, any people who, in Soviet view, might form even a kernel of passive resistance are being deported to forced labor in Russia and Siberia. One of those people was Alexandras Pelitsis.
He was a teacher, and in 1945 he brought a Christmas tree to the class. The next day he was deported for that.
need inimesed, kes sel ajal elasid, ainult need saavad sellest aru, milline õhkkond tookord valitses ja mismoodi see kõik oli.
Aili Yogi was 14 when the Soviets reoccupied her hometown of Tallinn. From her bedroom window, she saw how the Soviets removed the national flag in the center of Tallinn.
See oli niisugune trots meil sees, et kuidas, meid õpetati mustvalgeks, eks ole, lapsel on mustvalge.
It was then that Aili first thought of carrying out an act of resistance that would show the world that Estonians had not succumbed to their Soviet occupiers. It was an act that would later make her the national hero of Estonia.
Niisugune puulobutik, punane viisnurk üleval, imetle seda siis seal keset Tallinnat. Ja see imetlusaeg sai nagu otse. Ja mõtlesime, et mis me teeme siis, et tuleb ikka õhku lasta.
On the night of May the 7th, 1946, Aili and her classmate Ageda approached the Soviet monument, planted a bomb, and lit the fuse. A powerful explosion sent the Soviet monument soaring into the air. Aili was arrested.
Et seal koridoris, seal oli meil pool klassi oli seal. Rohkem kui pool klassi. Seal kellega me oleme rääkinud ja kes kellega oli rääkinud ja kõik võeti sinna kokku.
Despite the threat of imprisonment and death, thousands upon thousands of young people defied the occupying regime. Numerous underground youth organizations scattered throughout all 3 Baltic states. The youths printed leaflets and encouraged their fellow countrymen not to lose hope.
Tā cerība vismaz 10 gadus pēc kara bija, ka tas nebūs ilgi. Cilvēki gaidīja, cerēja.
Ko viņi gaidīja?
Gaidīja tiešām karu. Lai tas tik briesmīgi izklausās, gaidīja, ka nāks rietumi iekšā. Jā, tā tas bija.
These hopes were not without foundation, as the possibility of a new war was taken seriously in the West at the time.
The Russian cynical blockade of Berlin had brought Europe to the brink of war. It was at last clear that only a strong defensive alliance could deter them from further adventures. On 4 April 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed by Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Italy, Portugal, the United Kingdom, Iceland, Canada, and the United States.
Through the creation of NATO and the fact that there might be a war between the Soviet Union and the West, there was going to be a question of combat operations in the Baltic, and in particular of the Russian ability to move troops from bases around Leningrad, let's say, Tallinn or Klaipėda, to invade the North German coast.
The Americans still thought into the early 1950s that there was a distinct possibility of another war against the Soviet Union, and that the resistance movements would be part of that.
I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures.
Visi klausies BBC, Amerikas balsi, tie kauteris likti. Turieties līdz lieldienam, mēs nāksim palīgā, izdzīsim Krievus.
Expecting Western intervention and preparing for the final showdown, many took up arms and joined the ranks of partisans.
When your country is destroyed, or life is destroyed, your family is destroyed, your children are disappeared. So what to do? Revenge, and they went till the end. because they wanted to live as a free people and die as a free people.
Tens of thousands of Baltic men took to the forests and became the so-called Forest Brothers. The most large-scale resistance was in Lithuania.
Mana māja visi bijām iesaistījuši pretošanās kustībā. Ir tēvs, ir māsas, viena ir otra. Vēlēšanas bija ļoti liela vēlēšanas, ka nebūtu okupantu.
Nearly every family in Lithuania had someone in the resistance. The movement was massive and highly effective. It was structured and organized by former officers of the Lithuanian army, according to a classical pattern of armed resistance in enemy-occupied territory. The partisan forces were divided into 9 districts, with regional commanders and a network of underground military units. The partisan groups lived in specially constructed forest bunkers. The head of the Lithuanian resistance was Jonas Žemaitis. Eleonora Rubine was his personal aide and liaison.
Un Žemaitis man pateica, jāiet tev prom no mājām, jo tevi jau nāks arestēt. Un jā, no rīta, lieldienu rīta, vecāki pēc neaizgāja uz baznīcu, mēs pabrokastējam un es aizgāju. Aizgāju prom no mājām, un pusdienas laiku bija atnākuši mani arestēt.
Eleonora avoided arrest and carried on with her underground work of helping Žemaitis coordinate the resistance movement. Despite the Iron Curtain and heavily guarded borders, members of the resistance were secretly sent to the West to establish contacts with the Western governments and seek their help in fighting the Soviets.
By about 1947, the government's attitude was that they should give support to these resistance movements.
The British Secret Service, MI6, was instrumental in providing this support. It recruited volunteers from within the Baltic emigres and trained them as agents. The training was done in safe houses, such as 111 Old Church Street in London, where the Balts were taught radio coding and intelligence gathering. The agents were then secretly landed in Soviet territory. But instead of providing intelligence, most of the agents were lost.
The Soviets were very, very good at countering the operations into the Baltics. They were very good at inserting agents into networks. So from very early on, the Soviets were aware of planning for operations.
In many instances, they were able to arrest and apprehend intelligence agents after their first or second transmission of a message out to the West. So the net effect was that groups were sent in, but pretty quickly captured.
Despite the failures of the Western agents, the Baltic resistance went on. Armed attacks on Soviet officials and collaborators became part of everyday life in the post-war Baltic states.
Лесные братья применяли классические партизанские методы борьбы по принципу «ударил, убежал». Они нападали на какие-то, обычно как минимум уездные центры. Пытались уничтожать отдельных советских активистов, а также небольшие отряды войск МГБ и советской армии.
Receiving no tangible aid from the West, the resistance movement largely depended on the support of the local population, which provided food and shelter. The Soviets deported tens of thousands of ordinary peasants, women and children in their attempts to cut support for the partisans. The Forest Brothers also acquired additional food and supplies by attacking and looting state shops and enterprises. To save the local shopkeepers from KGB repression, the partisans left receipts listing the quantities of products and money they had confiscated. Unable to suppress the resistance with army and police, the Soviets recruited the so-called destroyers. These were Soviet armed collaborators involved in anti-partisan operations. Moscow also used the policy of building Russian settlements as a means to subdue the occupied territories. One such colony was established in Obshurutai village in southwestern Lithuania. The armed Russian settlers terrorized the local population. In November 1947, partisans surrounded the village and ordered the Russians to leave. In response, settlers lost their lives. The incident was reported by the main Soviet newspaper Pravda. It turned out to be a propaganda mistake, as the Russian colonists became too afraid to settle in Lithuania.
Baidījās. No meža brāļiem baidījās ļoti. Jo viņi tā, tur bija, cik ir uzbrukuši nevienu reizi tur šitā tos milicijas posteņus viņi iztrankāja. Jo ir vienu Tauragē tur bija palaida cietumu. No cietuma izbēga visi, jā.
The movement was so effective and inflicted such damage to the communists that Stalin sent his best forces to combat the Lithuanian guerrillas. Alexei Konchin was a member of the elite KGB Dzerzhinsky division. He took part in the 1945 victory parade in Red Square. Right after that, he was sent to the Soviet-occupied Lithuania to fight the resistance.
Война кончилась в 1945-м, а продолжалась война с бандитизмом до 1951 года. Так представляешь, сколько там нашего брата участвовало? Там же целые подразделения были в Литве тоже, помимо нас, а мы дополнительно выезжали туда, из Москвы. У нас полк был оперативный. Вот, на операции выезжали. Это проческа лесов, все болота прочесали, все хутора. Ой, сколько там долго порядок наводили. И до сих пор, по-моему, не навели.
The whole purpose of the Soviet Union was to dominate and occupy. It wasn't to tolerate and discuss with these people. So these were described as fascists, they were described as enemies of the people, and the whole purpose of the KGB was to destroy them.
The Soviets used scorch and destroy tactics, mapping out areas, rounding up people, and destroying everything which might provide shelter for the partisans.
Отдельные районы даже прочесывали и забирали с 16 до любого возраста, мужской. Помню такой случай. Мы леса прочесывали с одной стороны, а с другой стороны эти стояли, как она, ядрить твою мать, не вспомню. Короче говоря, целые семьи их, они еще не укреплялись и выгоняли их и уничтожали, короче говоря.
The corpses of the killed resistance fighters were usually brought to the villages and displayed there for weeks. KGB spies would then report the people who cried at the sight. The relatives and supporters of the partisans were arrested and brutally tortured.
Kā tur sita, Jēzus Marija, kā cietumā sita, bez jēgas. Man viss ķermenis ir sadauzīts līdz pēdējiem, man tikai čaula ārēja ir. Mani čistas ir saugušies, mugura salauzta ir, kājas man šeit bija, saka, pati muskuli, ja pat arī sauga, jo
pratinātājs ar ķeblīti kā sita tā pa galvu, vai ne? Tā es arī šobrīd nezinu, kas īsti notika ar manu vienu aci, vai ne? Bet, protams, mani tajā reizē tūliņ aizveda uz slimnīcu, un tad man pateica, zināt ko, bet jūs to acis nekad neredzēsiet vairāk.
To get Karlis Kvants out of the forest, the KGB arrested his pregnant wife. In prison, she gave birth to a boy, who died there a week later. She was forced to sign this paper, promising to keep silent about it. Karlis Kvants avenged his wife and son by killing the local Communist Party leader. Soon afterwards, he was hunted down by the KGB and killed. 61 years later, the dairy can buried by Kvants was found not far from his bunker. His grave has never been found. In the last days of the Soviet Union, British journalist Tom Bauer went to Riga and met the KGB generals who had been in charge of the anti-partisan operations in the late 1940s. They were proud of their achievements.
They wanted it recorded for history, and that is why when I turned up, they were very keen to help. I mean, I was the first one there and probably the last, but it was an astonishing moment in history, and we're sitting here only today because they agreed at that moment to tell their story.
But they did not tell the whole story.
Во время прочесывания лесных массивов и бандопособнических хуторов в Армской волости были убиты 16 человек. Это выдержка из подлинных документов, в которых сотрудник КГБ сообщает о своих подвигах на территории Латвии высшему руководству.
Nejauši atrasti kādi čekas darbinieka dokumenti un liecības par valsts drošības komitejas slepenajām operācijām Latvijā. Pēc čekista nāves tuvinieki domājams nemaz nav zinājuši par šādu dokumentu eksistenci.
It was a list of anti-partisan operations compiled by former KGB officer Kalugin, who participated in them. His chilling description was not meant for public use. He made it to substantiate his claim for a war veteran pension, which he was granted. One of the largest operations mentioned in Kalugin's papers was the destruction of the joint Latvian-Lithuanian partisan group in the Ile forest. We managed to find the only living witness of that operation, Modris Zichmanis. He was in the forest bunker when the KGB surrounded it.
Sākās kauja 7:30 un 3:30 beidzās. Un bunkuru izsita caurums un sagāza iekšā degvielu, tur muts un sašāva raķetes, aizdedzināja to benzīnu. Un tad sāka bunkurs degt. Daudz jau bija krituši, un tad citi ievainotie jau bija nošaušies paši, kas bija smagāk ievainoti. Tā kā mūs no 24 kaujas sākumā saņēma ciet 17, kas bija vēl ievainoti un nosmakuši domos.
For 7 hours, the partisans fought a desperate battle against the massive KGB force surrounding them. There were casualties on both sides. Alexei Konchin took part in a similar anti-partisan operation. It left him handicapped for the rest of his life.
Они отстреливали из гранат оттуда, из бункера бросали. Мы туда зажигательные туда бросали, и все. Вот и тогда гранатой бросили, И вот меня и ранило в колено, и вот и здесь пятна до сих пор видно ранение.
It was a bloody and merciless war that went on for a decade. Cut from the rest of the world by the Iron Curtain, the desperate fight of the Baltic partisans was largely unknown in the West. The local Soviet media covered the ongoing war with a blanket of silence. Only scarce accounts were published depicting the partisans as bandits.
Mēs jau bijām bandīti. Nacionālajā partizāni jau nebija tāds vārds Krievu leksikā. Bandīti. Mēs jau šāvām izstribīķeļus, komandierus un čekistus. Tas jau bija mūsu uzdevums. Mežbrāļiem. Tādus pagastus, kur bija tad indīgi, tie varas vīri vietējā, un kas tur bija noziegušies, un daudz cilvēkus izsūtījuši uz Sibīriju, tos jau pirmos mēs novācam. Pēc kara akcijas taisījām.
The war went on not only in the forests and provincial towns. There were groups that operated in the Baltic capital cities, right next to the Soviet military command and occupation administration. One of the most courageous and fearless was a group of 20 partisans led by Talrij Krastinš. A charismatic young Latvian, always laughing and witty, he did not look dangerous or suspicious to the KGB. But behind the mask of the cheerful playboy was a man who masterminded the most daring operation of the Latvian resistance. The attempted assassination of the Prime Minister of the puppet Soviet Latvian government, Vilis Lācis. Vilis Lācis was a quintessential collaborator, a Latvian quisling. He was responsible for the deportation and death of thousands of his countrymen. His assassination was intended as a demonstration. It had to take place in the center of Riga, in broad daylight.
Pa viņu arī bija liela nauda izsolīta pa Talriti, kas atķera. Un viņš teica, mani paņem ciet, un tagad mani ved, viņš saka, es sašļūku, pleci nolaižās. Un tur, kur kā, tur kāp pat repiem, viņš kāpja, un tur ir kaut kāda stacija, un tur ir un teica, un momentā es raujos ārā, un tur, kur daudz cilvēku lec iekšā, un skrien prom, un aizmūk no čekas.
Krastinš was detained by the Soviet authorities 4 times, but miraculously he managed to escape each time, leaving his captors empty-handed and sometimes dead. His group operated from a flat on Pumpura Street in the very center of Riga. Krastinš used city bars and restaurants to meet Soviet officials and get closer to the inner circle of the Soviet leadership.
Viņi saka, visus šitos te čekus varēja nopirkt par naudu. Viņi visi bija pērkami. Un viņš viņus arī pirka un nopirka viņa.
Krastinš bribed the Soviet police and army officers with whom he became acquainted in Riga bars. When the head of supplies of the Baltic military district, Major Vorontsov, was offered 10% of an undocumented truckload of butter, he was unable to refuse. Little did he know that the day before the butter had been looted by the partisans from a state dairy in Vilce parish.
Iebraucam iekšā pie armijas noliktavām, tur jau viņš pazvanīts, jau zina, ka būs, atverās vārti, iebrauc mašīnu iekšā, vārti ciet, sarkan armijas pie durvju, pie vārtiem un viss. Glīt un mierīgi, viņam 10%. Pāries mūsu naudu. Maksāt viņš uzreiz. Ar 10% viņš tādēļ pa 10, 20, 30 tūkstoši vienā reizē rubļus. Viņam bija labi, mums bija labi, jā. Ar to naudu mēs operējām. Viņš jau nezina, ka es esmu laukpītājs. Viņš domāja, ka tāds pagrīdes darbonis, kas tirgojas šokolādes. Es gandrīz no smiekliem nobrīdzos. Bet tā es jau nepateicu, ka tas ir laukpīts vai kā.
Major Vorontsov, to whom the partisans sold the looted butter, was later tried by the military tribunal. Using connections and bribes, Krastinch supplied the partisans with legal ID papers, allowing them to operate freely in the Soviet-occupied homeland.
Ja mums bija tāda drošība sajūta, es jums pasaku, ka tā no visas sirds, ka mēs nevienu dienu nejūtamies, ka mūs vajā. Viņi bija vajājami. Mēs medījām viņus.
The assassination of Vilis Latsis was scheduled for October the 7th, 1947. It was to take place here, near the Prime Minister's house at number 13 Elizabethas Street in Riga. The weapons for the operation, 2 F1 grenades and a pistol, were supplied and ready.
Bet tā mēs gribam viņu dzīvokli uz Elizabetes ielu. Novāktu apsardzi un nošaut viņu tieši tur pie mājas. Mums bija atkal viens no viņa te aparātā, vien krievuškiņi. Sapazināmies, viņa viss pateica, kur viņš ies, kur ir, kā tā sistēma, kā viņš ir apsardzāts.
But the plan was never implemented. A day before the attack, on October the 6th, Talrīds Krastinch and the rest of the group were arrested. They were betrayed by a KGB informer. The trial took place in March of 1948. The case was heard by the War Tribunal. None of the accused repented. Speaking through an interpreter, 21-year-old Alfons Malovka told the Russian judges that the duty of every Latvian was to fight against the Soviet regime. Ilmash Krastinch, I fought for a Latvia without communists. I have not changed my views. I will fight for Latvia and will die for it. The defiant young men escaped death, only because in 1948 capital punishment in the USSR was temporarily repealed. They were sentenced to 25 years in concentration camps. "25 years of hard labor. It was the sentence of many thousands of Baltic resistance fighters, of those who survived. But many did not survive. They were killed fighting the occupiers. Countless unnamed heroes in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Countless individual tragedies. Regina Latsis lived in a bunker until 1952. All her family were involved in the resistance.
Nu, tētis, mamma un 4 mēs. Nu, viss jau nošāva. Man jau no dzīvajiem nepalika neviens. Visi jau tika nošauti. Nu, jo bunkurā jau to brāli nošāva, māsas abas divas, vai ne? Un tā kā no tie, kas jau bija, ar ko es kopā biju tajā mežā, vai ne, tie jau visi aizgāja viņu saulītē.
The last photo of Regina's 2 older sisters and brother is in the KGB archive. The oldest sister, who was killed in the bunker, had a newborn son. He survived.
Inārs Zariņš, tēvs un māte, kas šeit krita, it kā šeit dzimu.
Un kur jūs piedzimāt tieši?
Mēs šī mājā piedzim, te bunkurā. Tieši šeit dzimšanas man vieta ir. Tā kā tāds divējāds izjūtas, it kā šeit dzimšanas vieta, bet nu arī, kā vecāki gājuši bojā, tad tāds, tādas izjūtas tāds.
The armed struggle of the Baltic people against the Soviet occupation continued up to the mid-1950s. Passive resistance was never extinguished, and the spirit of freedom was never broken. Half a century later, as the Soviet Union crumbled, the Baltic independence movements facilitated its downfall. In 1991, the three Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania became free again. The struggle for independence, once fought by the partisans, was over.